Today's scripture is Genesis 25:21 through 28. Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife, because she was barren, and the Lord granted his prayer, and his wife Rebekah conceived. The children struggled together within her, and she said, "If it is to be this way, why do I live?" So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples born of you shall be divided. One shall be stronger than the other. The elder shall serve the younger." When the time to give birth was at hand, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red. All his body was a hairy mantle, so they named him Esau. Afterwards, his brother came out with his hand gripping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob. Esau was 60 years old when she bore them. When the boy grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man in the field, while Jacob was a quiet man living in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he was fond of game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. This is the word of the Lord.
So, last week we talked about Bishop Milton Wright, who famously said people would never fly, and then went on to, of course, give birth to two sons who made people fly, Orville and Wilbur. And I wasn't expecting to come back to that family, but as I was prepping for today, I recognized that actually Wilbur's sons have something to say to us. So today what we're going to do is there's actually three different pairs of brothers that we're going to talk about. The one we just heard about in a minute, we're going to talk about them. But first, I want to talk about that pair of brothers who proved their dad wrong, who we know as Orville and Wilbur Wright. Now, I went to seminary in Ohio, and the Wright brothers are a little unavoidable, in the state of Ohio. That is something that they are very proud of, and I think one of those things that they have some friendly competition with, I believe it is North Carolina, about who gets to claim them more. Right? Because they were from Ohio and Dayton, and that's where the bicycle factory was and all that, but that's not where they flew. They flew on a beach on the Atlantic Ocean in a different state. And I can't remember which state it was who put the flyer on their license plate but put it the wrong way around. I think it was North Carolina, but I don't remember, but it was super funny. But there's a little rivalry that happens there. And the Wright brothers were a lot of people. I mean, obviously, their father being a bishop in one of the antecedent denominations of the Methodist Church, we claim them as ours because we like to claim people. So we claim them as Methodists. They, of course, were people of deep religious background and conviction. They actually, neither brother ever married. And they spent most of their lives living together in a home for most of that time with their sister, Catherine, who was a school teacher, and their dad. So I like to imagine that their dad, the bishop in the church, made him go to church like good dads should. So that's how they grew up. Neither one of them got a diploma from high school. One finished their coursework but didn't actually get the piece of paper. The other one didn't. And in fact, of all of the brothers and all of the children, they had 7 children, Milton Wright and his wife did. The sister, Catherine, was one of the only ones who actually finished high school, went on to college, and she became a school teacher. So the Wrights were really a self-educated bunch. Wilbur actually built his own printing press at one point in his high school career, and instead of finishing high school, decided to launch a newspaper. And then they got together at a different time and decided they wanted to take advantage of this incredible fad and hot new trend and this hot new technology. So they wanted to start this hot technology startup that was kind of sweeping the country at the time, and that, of course, was the massive innovation of the bicycle. And we don't think of the bicycle as an innovative technology, but 150 years ago it was. And so they open a bicycle shop and a repair shop, and they build bicycles and all that kind of stuff. And at some point, they remember back to their childhood where they were given a flying helicopter toy by their dad, one of the few toys that they received, and they started to get really curious about flight. And that is what led them to do this. Now, they actually were very similar in their passions and their interests, but very different in terms of personality. There was one that was very outgoing and gregarious and fun to be around. There was another who preferred to be by themselves and all of that. And while they were both interested in this problem of flight, or this idea of flight and what it might mean, their approaches to it were actually very different. And because of that, their sister especially records that they had a number of very heated arguments as they were doing their work about a lot of different things. Despite that, and despite the heated level of the arguments they would still continue to work together, live together, and be around each other their entire lives. And one of the things that their sister records, and that they themselves record, is not what they argued about necessarily, but how they did. Because the one thing that Orban and Wilbur were very, very careful of when they were debating whatever it is they were debating was to make sure that the conversation and the debate stayed about the topic and what it is they were talking about and did not become personal about each other. A later author who wrote their autobiography would say they argued because they sought truth, not because one brother desired to win victory over the other. And I believe it was Orwell himself wrote later, he says, often, after an hour or so of heated argument, we would discover that we were as far from agreement as when we started, but that each of us had changed to the other's original position. They argued so strongly that sometimes they would win each other over at the same time and then just swap sides and continue to argue. And yet they would say over and over and over again, they remained the best of friends. People will disagree in life. People who are close together, people who have significant relationships with each other, whether that be through marriage or siblings or just really deep, long-lasting friendships or whatever, you will have times when you don't agree with one another. You will have times when you want different things, either for yourselves or for each other. That is just going to happen. And the more that you intend and try to do together, the more that those things are going to come up. It is somewhat inevitable. The question is, how are we going to do it? How are we going to disagree? And what does that look like? Recently, I have been releasing online through a podcast series a podcast around politics, which is something I never talk about here. And if you've listened to it, you know it's not actually about politics, so don't get excited. But as part of it is like, how do we think about these parts of our lives? And in that podcast, in one of the episodes, I talk about this research which was done about the dignity index. Basically, how much dignity are we extending to ourselves and others? And I would say the Wright brothers, in how they chose to argue and debate with each other, score really at the top of the mark as far as that idea goes. Because neither one really called into question the other person's right to hold the opinion they did, even if they disagreed. Neither one saw the other one being wrong in their opinion as somehow meaning that that person was intrinsically or inherently bad or wrong. They chose instead to keep the argument about what it needed to be about, which for them was trying to discover together whatever truth it was that they were looking to find. I think the Wright brothers are a good example of how it is that we can, if we choose, interact with each other in that way. I think in the story we read this morning about Jacob and Esau is the cautionary example of what happens when we don't. So Jacob and Esau are introduced. We're still in the book of Genesis, if you have noticed. And where we are is basically, we've had Abraham and Sarah. Abraham and Sarah, we talked about Sarah last week. Sarah does finally conceive and have a child of her own named Isaac. Isaac then gets married to a woman named Rebekah. They struggle to conceive in the beginning as they want to do. Remember, this is all under the guise that Abraham is supposed to become the father of a great nation. There's supposed to be a multitude of people that come from Abraham's line, but Abraham himself does not have very many children. And so that idea, that calling to become part of the institution of this whole great group of people then falls to Isaac and Rebekah, who then themselves conceive, and she conceives and bears twins, her first children, which we talked about, which we read about today, Jacob and Esau. I think it's really funny and interesting that when we're first introduced to Jacob and Esau, we were given a couple of pieces of information, and one of the pieces of information we're given right off the bat is that Jacob and Esau's parents had favorites and didn't apparently hide it. Most of us hide it. No, I don't have favorites. I love you both. They're both here today. But they do. They clearly do. And it says, and they even gives the reason why that they do. And Jacob and Esau, despite being not identical twins, but clearly fraternal twins, we're told they don't look the same. Even back then, they understood that there were a couple different kinds of twins. So they're fraternal twins, but they're born at the same time to the same parents. They grow up in the same place. They are probably throughout their lives, because these are nomadic people who live in tents. Jacob and Esau, as they are growing up, probably don't spend very much time apart from each other, right? And yet, if we continue to read in the story, we know that they become very different people with different interests. Esau loves the woods. He loves going out to hunt. He doesn't really want to be in the tents necessarily around the people as much, and he is more of a rugged kind of athletic guy doing that sort of thing. Jacob, on the other hand, we were told right from the beginning, isn't so much interested in that, but actually wants to be in the tents, wants to be around the people. And you can kind of read between the lines and read fairly quickly that Jacob, especially if you continue to read the story and where it goes, Jacob is probably the more interested and charismatic of the two. Probably the more political of the two, versus Esau, who's probably a little bit more of a loner, a little bit more prefers to be on his own. And yet, Esau is born first, which means a great deal at the time in which they live. Because the eldest son gets the birthright, the eldest son gets the largest share of whatever it is his parents have. And if there is anything, any title, or any specialness to the family, especially any specialness to the father, then that is going to pass down through the generations through the eldest son. This is a tradition that, continues, even through, if you think about like medieval history and even Britain and all that kind of stuff, right? How are titles and lands and everything handed down for millennia upon millennia? They were always handed down through the eldest son. And so Esau, by virtue of basically being born first, though as we read, Jacob did everything he could to try to make sure that they were born as close together as possible. I mean, if he's grabbing on that heel, it's a matter of seconds here. Biologically, I'm not sure that works, but that's okay. But that's how it is. And so Esau, clearly also being his father favorite, who is the one, Isaac is again the inheritor of the promise from Abraham, is being raised in this role, raised with this idea that he is going to have this birthright and he is going to be the one that continues on the work of Abram and Isaac. It is clear, if we continue reading in the story, that Esau is probably not actually very interested in that. And one of the ways that we know it is that when Esau comes of age, he chooses not to get married to somebody within the community, within the people. He goes outside of it, something that his parents really don't like. Meanwhile, Jacob continues to live in the tent, continues to be around people, and continues to do things. For some reason that we are not told, Jacob and Esau are not able to have a conversation about what it is that they really desire. You have to read between the lines a little bit, and scholars have, and early Jewish commentators have, and when they do that, they kind of see a world where Esau has the birthright, but probably doesn't actually want it all that much. And Jacob, who does not probably wants it very much. But instead of there being a conversation between them about what it is that they truly want out of life, what it is they truly want out of this, instead of there being any kind of dialogue between them, instead, Jacob chooses to engage in some trickery. And one day, when Esau is very hungry after coming in for the field, Jacob has some food, and Esau comes in and he says, "Hey, brother, can I have half your sandwich, please?" More or less would be the modern equivalent. Like, "I'm hungry, can I have half your sandwich?" And Jacob goes, "Sure, it will just cost you your birthright." And Esau agrees. Again, clearly, doesn't believe that his brother's doesn't actually believe his brother's means what he says, or doesn't really care. Because I've been hungry, and maybe I've just never been as hungry as Esau's been hungry, but I don't know that I've ever been that hungry. That not worrying that that's not actually going to be enough, Jacob then later actually goes and conspires and dresses up as his brother, putting on lamb skin so he's extra hairy at a time after his father's eyesight is healed, and pretends to be his brother Esau, so that when his father really does truly give off the birthright towards the end of his life, he goes and pretends to be his dad, or pretends to be his brother, and has his dad bless him instead. All of this actually creates a rift between them, to the point where Jacob has to flee. And even though Jacob technically has the birthright at this point, he never actually gets to take advantage of it, because he has to run away to another country, where he then spends some years there having an adventure. They do eventually in the story reconcile, which is a whole other sermon. But I have to wonder, and I think we are left to wonder, if Jacob and Esau could come together, converse together, debate together, and dialogue together the way that the Wright brothers could, would this story be different? Would there be as much hardship? Would there be as much drama? Would there be as many years away? Would there be so much fear and anxiety that it pervades everything that happens? Or could things have been resolved differently if they were both able to speak a little bit better their own strength, their own truths and desires, and listen to the truths and the desires of their brother? I think it is. I think that's one of the things that we take from the story is a caution about not doing these things. Because the truth is, when people who are not the same but share interest and passion get together, it is those times when those interests and those passions align, and the various gifts and graces that we all have, and the differences of opinions and different perspectives, when they come together and they're able to collaborate, when they're able to work together, when they're able to think through and discuss and debate through their differences, when they are able to treat each other with continued dignity and respect, even while they are disagreeing about things passionately that they find deeply important, great and amazing things can happen. Not just flight, but in fact, the church to which the Wright brothers belonged, that their dad was a bishop of, that entire movement owes itself to our third set of brothers for today, and that, of course, was John and Charles Wesley. And I talk about John Wesley a lot because I love John Wesley. He left behind all his sermons, he left behind all his writings, and all that kind of stuff, and he's really the one that tends to get top billing, but the truth is the Methodist Church wouldn't be here if it wasn't for both of them, because while John was off preaching and doing all those things, Charles was writing the music. Charles wrote over 3,000 hymns during his life. And long after John's come through the town, come through the community, and the words that he preached have faded, the community he left behind, that gathering of early Methodists would continue to sing the songs that Charles wrote. We need both of them to be here today. And they did not always agree. I have bound copies of all of Wesley's letters, and I really enjoy reading the Wesley letters that John wrote to his brother. And it's usually when they are having some sort of disagreement. And in those letters, it is completely obvious that John's biggest priority is to make sure that somehow the two of them can be reconciled and come to some sort of mutual agreement about whatever it is they're debating. And what they are typically debating is some kind of very esoteric theological argument or some concept that is deeply, deeply important to them that none of us in this room probably care about. But for them, it was a challenge because John was like, I can't be out preaching a different theology than you are writing songs about. That's not going to work. So we have to come to some sort of conclusion, and we both feel very passionate about this. How are we going to do it? And they write passionately to each other about whatever it is that they are talking about. And it's always similar to the Wright Brothers would be 100 years later. It is always, though, about the topic. Never in any one of those letters does John attack his brother or to attack his dignity, or attack him as a person. He simply says, this is what I think, this is why I believe it. Please help me understand what you think and why you believe it and how it is we are going to reconcile these two things. Because for the good of this thing we are starting, for the good of the Methodist movement, for the good of this work that God himself has called us to do, we must do that. God is able to work through Jacob and Esau and able to get Jacob to do the things that he needs to do. It will cost Jacob a lot of time and energy and effort and pain and suffering and literally at one point wrestling with God on the side of a mountain to the point where his hip gets dislocated. That's how much it takes for God to get through to Jacob what it is he needs to do, who it is he needs to be. And God wrestles with him as Jacob is on his way to finally reconciling with his brother. I wonder how much the story could have been different if Jacob and Esau had chosen a different path earlier in their lives in how they interacted with each other. We all have deep and important personal relationships in our lives. Sometimes it is with a sibling. Oftentimes it is with a spouse. Oftentimes, it may be with a coworker or, again, a friend that we've had forever. What would it look like when those conflicts or when those disagreements rise if we were conscious and struggled not to be right and not to have victory over the other, but instead, what would it look like if we never forgot and never ceased to treat the person we are disagreeing with dignity? I think most of us would prefer that. Most of us would prefer to have the opportunity to speak our truths and to feel listened to, and would prefer to have the opportunity to hear from the other person and listen to them as well. We don't have to be like Jacob and Esau. It is comforting to know that even if when we are, God's work still isn't stymied. That even though we, instead of going along, might get in the way, God's work that he started with Abraham and moved through Isaac and moved through Jacob and on down the line is going to continue. The difference is, and the challenge is, are we going to maintain our alignment to that work? Or are we going to endure more than we need to as we attempt to be right? I like this story. I think it tells us something important. I like that imperfect people are still able to do and be part of God's plan. I'm glad that perfection isn't the standard. I also take from this that at the end of the day, the only one Jacob and Esau really harm with their stubbornness towards each other is themselves. And I am reminded and challenged, as I hope you are too, that how we choose to interact with each other is, at the end of the day, up to us. God's work will persist. God's work will continue. Sometimes with us, sometimes despite us. I think it's better, and it goes easier if it's with us. Amen.